Welcome back to another one of your flip lectures. Today we're going to talk about the causes of the Revolutionary War. Just kind of a brief recap of the French and Indian War aftermath. After this war, Britain thought that the colonies should help pay for the war. After all, it was a war that involved them and was ultimately for their safety. Also, Britain tried to control colonial expansion, because if the colonists were to expand westward, that could mean another war with the natives. After this war as well, colonists believed that they were equal partners in the British Empire. England doesn't really believe that. Also, the colonies are going to begin thinking much more about working together. So this war can be seen coming partially from economic causes. The French and Indian wars are expensive, and so the British go heavily into debt. And so, in order to raise revenue, the British Empire is going to want to tax the American colonies. But like we talked about in class, the American colonies were actually taxed at very low rates. Americans paid less than half the taxes people in England, so what is this revolution really about? Is it about the amount of taxes, or is it about ideas? And I just kind of want to briefly run through the idea that this revolution is about a clash of ideologies. The colonists valued their self-rule, that there's an emphasis in the colonies on rights, that it's not really the tax rate, it's does Britain have the right to tax the colonies. This also has to do with the social contract, because the colonists are going to believe that they did not agree, they did not consent to the new government that the British are going to put in place. And at the very least, they want representation in Parliament so that they can have a vote, but England saw them as only colonies and did not give them representation. But also, this is about different expectations, that England and the American colonies have different ideas about what the future is going to look like. And this disagreement over vision is going to lead to some resentment and to some problems. So for England, they saw the French and Indian War as an opportunity to reform the colonies. The French and Indian War kind of upped the British presence, and so they were going to reform the colonies. And they wanted to bring the colonies closer into the British Empire. They had had so much autonomy, the colonies did, that England really wanted to bring them under tighter control. They were also looking at tax the colonies at rates that were kind of the average for the rest of the British colonies. That taxed the American colonies, that is. And then finally, kind of the sum of this is that England is looking to bring the American colonies, which had enjoyed a lot of freedom, back under tighter political control from England. In contrast, the colonies had a completely different expectation of what was going to happen. They thought that after the war, because they had fought in it, they would be more involved in the British Empire as equal partners. They also expected that the victory in the war would mean security from outside attack, which would mean that Britain would give them even more autonomy, even more freedom, and this would also lead to greater prosperity. And so ultimately, the colonies begin to see these British reforms as threats to their traditional governments and freedoms that they had been enjoying for some time already. So this is what I mean when I say that the revolution is not so much a revolution as it's going to be a return to the way things were before. But regardless of why this goes down, the American colonies got very messy very fast, because England is going to seek to both raise money from the colonies and bring them under tighter control. And so the decade from 1764 to 1774 was basically one big crisis after another in the American colonies. But most of the stuff we're going to talk about actually happened in the North. It's going to happen in Boston, in Philadelphia, and places like that. But the Southern colonies are going to join in. So why? Why would the Southern colonies join in if all the events are going to take place in the North? And there's a theory about this. And this is the theory of the Southern gentry. And this is the idea that the Southern gentry, the wealthy Southerners, the landowners, the political leaders, they wanted independence so they could have access to Western land and to the potential wealth that land represented. Also, there's a very cynical idea that these guys are trying to avoid having to pay debts to England because they had spent a lot of money and a lot of these guys were pretty heavy in debt. But there's a less cynical idea that really the Southern colonies, this revolutionary spirit is based on ideas. That the Southern colonies, these leaders are very well educated. They know John Locke, they know Montesquieu and the Enlightenment, and these people actually highly value freedom, liberty, and their rights. Remember, there's usually not one right answer, because history deals with people, and what people do, and their motivations, why they do it, are very complex. So remember, these are just ideas. This isn't necessarily the truth. So what happens to the decade of crisis is one event kind of leads to another until violence breaks out in the colonies. And the first kind of British reform that kicks off these tensions is the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that drew a line on the map that you can see in the image called the Line of Proclamation. What that Line of Proclamation said is that no American settler could go west of that proclamation line. And the idea is that they're trying to prevent wars with the Native Americans. But the colonists wanted access to that land. And so they began to believe that their freedom for expansion and freedom to live where they wanted in the New World was being violated. Then the colonies got upset over a series of taxes. The first was the Sugar Act, which was a higher tax on luxury items like silk and sugar, coffee. But the Sugar Act also allowed officials to seize any smuggled goods that did not pay the tax without any due process. There wouldn't be any trial, the goods would simply be seized. So the colonists believed this violated their rights. Also the Stamp Act, which is a direct tax, which is a tax that people have to pay directly. A trade tax, the trader, the merchant who brings the item in has to pay that. A direct tax is one that you have to pay as a person, like sales tax. And the Stamp Act was a tax on all printed materials. And the colonies used a lot of these printed materials, newspapers, etc. It's a picture of the stamp that they would use. Then in 1765, the Quartering Act was passed, in which Britain required the colonists to provide soldiers with provisions, food, shelter, all these things. And so the colonies now had to take on basically paying for and taking care of the British soldiers that were in the colonies. Now, the colonists rejected this so much and felt that they were not responsible for paying for this, that actually, in a lot of ways, this idea makes its way into the Constitution with the Third Amendment. But again, the colonists believe that kind of their self-rule, their autonomy is being challenged with these new laws. So in response to these laws, the Stamp Act Congress is called in 1765. And in response to the Stamp Act and all these things, the Stamp Act Congress is going to make an argument in protest against these British taxes. They're going to call on social contract theory to basically say that only the colonist political representatives, the ones whom they elect, have the right to tax them, because the colonists agreed to the government, and so they would agree to pay the taxes. They said Parliament does not have the right to tax them because they did not agree to these taxes and they did not have a vote. So in order to try to put pressure on the British, in order to basically change their perspective and get rid of the Stamp Act Congress, which is made up of leaders from all of the colonies, they actually organized a boycott in the colonies of all British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. So the Americans are starting to use peaceful protests, boycotts, in order to try to effect change. So right on the heels of the Stamp Act Congress, in Virginia, which was the largest colony and the wealthiest colony, they passed something known as the Virginia Resolves, which basically said the exact same thing as the Stamp Act Congress. That only the House of Burgesses, the House of Government elected by Virginians, had the right to tax. They also passed a non-importation law, thus facilitating the boycott. But the idea is that these taxes, they're unpopular everywhere. And all these colonies, they're starting to come up with the exact same reasons for why they are opposed to them. Although some people don't take the protest all that peacefully. A group crops up in Boston known as the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, and they're an anti-British, semi-terrorist organization. What they do is they burn effigies in the streets of tax collectors, of the king, of members of parliament, and try to rile people up for violence. They were known to harass and intimidate tax collectors, even in some cases destroying their homes and beating them up, tarring and feathering them. And so these Sons of Liberty were pretty rough and tumble characters, very radical. The Daughters of Liberty, for their part, During the boycotts, they sewed clothing so that the United States wouldn't be as reliant upon British goods, and they helped the Sons of Liberty plan a lot of their action. In response to these tensions, in response to some violence, Great Britain tried to bring the colonies under tighter control with a series of laws known as the Townshend Acts. And as you can see in this image, there is a tax collector being tarred and feathered, which is how a lot of the colonists reacted to these laws. But these laws kind of violated a lot of rights that the colonists thought that they had. The first act was the Revenue Act, which all this meant was that there was new taxes on imports. So those original arguments against taxes, those are coming up again. Then the British decided that they would hold all trials in Vice Admiralty courts. And in Vice Admiralty courts, you are not presumed innocent, you are presumed guilty, and you must prove your innocence. The American colonists believed that this violated their right to basically a fair trial. Townshend Acts also allowed the seizing of property, both smuggled or not, without following due process. That the soldiers, the authorities, could seize any goods without allowing any recourse in the courts. Then finally, the Townshend Acts had what is known as writs of assistance, which were general search warrants allowing soldiers, police, whomever, government officials to go anywhere without any sort of specific evidence, without any sort of specific things that they're looking for. So you can probably already see from these Townshend Acts that a lot of the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights comes from opposition to these things that the British were doing. So the Townshend Acts caused a lot of discontent. There was a lot of anger in the colonies. A lot of people were upset about various things, and so that spilled out into the streets, and an event known as the Boston Massacre. And what happens at the Boston Massacre is a crowd was heckling British soldiers on the street, throwing snowballs at them and yelling at them, and British soldiers, believing that they were under attack, opened fire on a mob of people. There was huge outrage in the colonies. People galvanized it, they built it up into a giant story, and there was a lot of outrage. They painted the British as ruthless oppressors who didn't really care if they killed colonists. And so Britain, in response to this, in response to the overwhelming anger and the tension that was about to spill over into major violence, they actually got rid of these Townshend Acts to try to settle everybody down and diffuse the situation. So the British, in trying to keep the colonies kind of from revolting, from violence, they repeal every tax except for one, the Tea Act. And the Tea Act in 1773 was passed to give a certain company that was struggling, the British East India Trading Company, an unfair advantage over colonial merchants. So colonial merchants had to pay all of the taxes on goods. The British East India Trading Company only had to pay 1/5 of the taxes. And they were also allowed now to sell directly to shopkeepers without going through colonial merchants. And so these colonial merchants believed that the British were squeezing them out, that they were taking their livelihood, that they weren't respecting kind of the laws and the economic system in the colonies. And so in response to the Tea Act, the Sons of Liberty organized what becomes known as the Boston Tea Party. Though it wasn't much of a party, because it involved 150 men dumping out about $1 million worth of tea, it's a lot of money lost, into Boston Harbor. And actually, as you can see, a crowd actually turns out to see these people dump the tea. They dress up in costume so that the Sons of Liberty who carry out this act will not be able to be identified. They actually dress up as Native Americans. But this act of resistance, this destruction of $1 million worth of British property, leads to King George III cracking down heavily on any challenges to British authority in the colony, which leads us to the Coercive Acts of 1774. As you can see from this political cartoon, the symbol of America in the middle is being held down and forced to drink tea by the British, while Lady Liberty, Lady Justice, looks off in horror. And the Coercive Acts were really a crackdown on the political protests going on in Boston. They shut down the port of Boston, which meant that a lot of people who worked at that port would lose their jobs. All council members, judges, sheriffs, all political officials in Massachusetts were no longer elected. In fact, they actually kick out all the elected people, and the governor, appointed by the Crown of England, appoints all of the officials. They banned democratic town meetings, and they allowed the governor to transfer soldiers to England rather than have them stand trial in the United States. So the idea was that the soldiers now were not subject to colonial law. And also, local officials must provide lodging to soldiers even in private homes. So these coercive acts were seen as a really serious crackdown and violation of the rights of these colonists. And so the coercive acts in a lot of ways violate traditional English rights. They violate the right to a trial by jury of peers, the right to not have troops quartered in one's home, and the king was actually not supposed to have a standing army in peacetime without the consent of Parliament. In this case, the colonies wanted their assemblies to justify any British soldiers in the colony. So in response to the coercive acts, the First Continental Congress was called in 1774. They meet because of the coercive acts, understanding that something is going to have to change. And the people who show up to this are people you've probably heard of. John Adams and Samuel Adams from Massachusetts, Patrick Henry, George Washington from Virginia. You have John Adams, Samuel Adams, yes, he is the guy on the beer. You have Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And you have George Washington, the hero of the French and Indian War, who's one of the most respected leaders in all of the colonies. And these guys get together, representatives from the colonies, in order to try to figure out what are the colonies going to do together. So that idea that Ben Franklin came up with about the colonies working together, it is now a reality. And so they draft the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which was a document that was supposed to spell out what the colonies wanted from the British. And what it said was, first and foremost, they pledged loyalty to the king. Because the last thing that these colonists want is for the king to think that they are rebelling, hang them all, send the entire British army to the Americas. And so they pledge loyalty to the king. But they then go on to say that the coercive acts were wrong, and they condemn them openly. They also announced non-importation agreements. They announced more boycotts of British goods, and they said that we will enforce the boycotts in the colonies. And the First Continental Congress is actually seen as legitimate enough because it's an elected government. It's not a government yet, but it's an elected group of people to represent the colonies. They see it as legitimate. And so at the Continental Congress, solidarity emerges. All the 13 colonies are going to work together. They also agree that if the crisis that is going on in the colonies is not resolved, that they would meet again in 1775, the following year. So now all the tensions are set, and all the pieces are moving for the American Revolution. But the war hasn't come yet. But in a lot of ways, this war can be seen as a clash of economy, politics, ideology, and ultimately a different view of what the British colonies in the Americas should be.